The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
We got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on Detroit. I'm being around that on the target right now. I've got a couple of these right in front of me. I'm going after it. Right, I got him.
Welcome back to the Lead Pursuit Podcast. Tonight, we're not going to talk about blood red skies, and I realize that may horrify some of you. But for the 10% of our audience that listens, that plays Check Your Six, you're going to be happy because tonight we're not just talking about Check Your Six. We're going to talk Jet Age, Check Your Six stuff, and we're going to talk about a specific module. So as a lot of you know, we've been working through some of the missile rules for blood red skies. Well, plagiarism and imitation is the finest form of flattery. So where am I going to figure out how you're supposed to actually write a scenario? None other than CB Stevens, the author of the Crisis in Kashmir module for Check Your Six. CB, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I also have one of my other non-Check Your Six players, Steve, on tonight. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
So between the two of us with our sum zero of Check Your Six knowledge, I will apologize at the start to CB and to all of our audience members who've actually played. I have to give Sandy and Rob and a bunch of other guys a huge shout out. They keep trying to drag me into online Check Your Six games. However, they usually send me a message at about 6 o'clock p.m. for an 8 p.m. game. So, guys, that doesn't work. My schedule is full of stupid stuff like making podcasts. So give me a little heads up and you can get me online and beat me up and Check Your Six, and we'll go from there. But I don't want to dwell too much on the rules because, frankly, I know none of them. And we're not really talking about that part of this source book and of this campaign book. We're going to talk about some of the neat things that we probably don't know if you're not a historian who's really dug into the India-Pakistan air wars, especially the 1965 over Kashmir. And we're going to dig through a little bit of how we ended up with someone like CB Stevens, not an aviator, as I'm sure he'll say, writing an aviation source book. So, CB, give us a little bit of your personal background and then how you, where you really got your start in wargaming.
Oh boy, you're going way back there. So I'll start with the how did I get into wargaming before I really talk about myself, because I don't know, that didn't come out quite the way I meant it. But I started wargaming
from the Dark Ages, and you're moving small little chunks of rock around on
exactly.
there next to Homer and Odysseus. Then I can understand why.
Yeah, exactly. No, going back to high school, and Sandy and I went to high school together, and we joined the War Games Club together. And but prior to that, I had been playing. I forgot that. I've probably since sixth grade I've been playing Avalon Hill board games. And then I learned that there were actually more than two other people in the world that enjoyed that when I got to high school. And then I continued to play Avalon Hill board games all through high school. And then, I went to college and learned that there were other things like beer and dancing.
all those things that we shouldn't have ever learned about had we wanted to be good war gamers. So let me derail you there for a second and ask, what were your favorite Avalon Hill games growing up? Because I too was an Avalon Hill baby, and I know which ones my pet rocks are.
Yeah, so I think you asked that question to Avalon Hill wargamers, and I have no doubt that most people are going to say a squad leader, and it was my favorite too, hands down. But I always loved the ground games. So Panzer Leader, Panzer Blitz were my other two favorites. Played a lot of Third Reich, but
you are a brave man. I actually opened the box that a friend of mine had once and said, "Ooh, that's a little complex," and put the box top right back on.
Yeah, no. When I was, like I said, I started probably in sixth grade playing board games, and I bought Third Reich. I don't know, maybe when I was in eighth grade, ninth grade, and I actually got an adult to play it with me, and boy, he just smeared me across the board. But I don't think I played it again very much after that.
Yeah. Like a lot of games, it ended up back on the shelf because I know that I always tended to fall into I obviously love Panzer Leader and Panzer Blitz, but enjoyed Africa Corps. Still enjoyed Tactics 2 as a wonderful intro game that was just mindless and you could have fun with, but definitely became a huge squad leader. Crescendo of Doom, Iron Cross, and GI Anvil fan.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Me too. I had gotten out of it by the time Advanced Squad Leader came along, but I remember, reading The General, if you remember The General, the Avalon Hill
Oh yeah, I
magazine.
dug up a couple of my copies out of storage while I was looking for the Crisis in Kashmir source book.
Right, right. Yeah. So I remember there was an article in The General, and this was while I was in high school, talking about how great it would be if you could play war games on a computer, and
What a
you wouldn't be able.
revolutionary idea.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be able to see the other person's pieces. It would be awesome. So yeah, I forgot. I lost my train of thought now. I don't remember where I was going with that. But
Well, I was going to actually give Sandy a shout out on that. I had things like that that seemed so revolutionary when Sandy sent me a text. I think it was this morning or yesterday. And he said, "Hey, are you interested in a play by email game of diplomacy?" I almost had to laugh because I hadn't thought of play by email in like the last 10 years because everything has been real time online via Roll20, Tabletop Sim, or whatever. So, Sandy, you're a dinosaur, but we still love you.
yeah, well, Sandy and me were both Luddites, I guess. So he sent me the same invite. So you be Austria-Hungary, and I'll be England. How about that?
Exactly. We'll see how that works out.
So more about me. So after high school and college, I ended up going into the military. So I was in ROTC in college, and I honestly will tell you that I learned a lot about tactics from playing squad leader, and it helped me be a better infantry officer and helped me be a better special forces officer. So that's where my career went after the military, infantry and then special forces. And then I left the army in '94 and spent a lot of time in Africa as a security manager, corporate security manager. And then I went back to work for the government doing anti-terrorism stuff and sort of been in that milieu ever since. But never, ever in my life have I been behind the controls of an airplane.
Well, then, you haven't scared yourself enough. As you probably heard, it's 5 minutes or 30 minutes of sheer boredom with 30 seconds of sheer terror at the end of it. But yeah, so I will laugh and say that I had no idea until we started talking before the podcast what your background was. And I find it funny how many people assume that everyone who plays aerial war games or writes aerial war games has to have a background in aviation, and that's just not true. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah, I was just going to say to riff on that a little bit that I never, setting aside the fact that we played the air war role playing game in
Yeah.
in high school, I never had any interest in air games at all. I thought airplanes were cool, but and flying them sounded like it might be fun, but never had any interest in aerial warfare. And it really just came about because my gaming buddies, and I don't even remember what year it was now, 2004 or something, when we wrote the book, decided that it would be fun to play an air war game, and that's how I got involved.
So I kind of had to laugh as we were talking before the podcast. There's, I think, two kinds of game designers out there. There's game designers who are sitting there smoking their pipe, drinking their cup of coffee, and the lightning bolt strikes their head and they say, I will create a game about whatever topic that has fascinated them or they've researched or whatever. Then there's the other, I don't know, whatever percentage. I probably should not lie and say it's really 80% that they will play somebody's game and they'll go, oh my God, I could do better than that. And that's an impetus for them to write. And whether or not they could do better, that isn't the answer. It's that causes the creative inspiration to go, what if we did something differently? What if, unlike Air War, we didn't make you need a PhD in aeronautical studies to actually be able to play the game? And so it sounds to me that's kind of how you ended up being involved creating and writing in Check Your Six.
Yeah, exactly. We picked up a set of rules as I was mentioning before the podcast started. Scott Fisher is very good about trying out lots of different sets of rules and finding the one that fits our group's playing style best, right? But we really hated the air war or the air rules that we had, and we had a horrible nickname for them, which I won't repeat again. But
Hey, we're an E-rated podcast. You could call anything what you want here.
All right, yeah. So, well, I don't actually remember what the name of the game was. I think it was Red Sun, Blue Sky, or something like that. But we hated it so much we called it Red Bra, Blue Panties, because it was just ridiculous. So we played it 2 or 3 times and we said, this is just crap. We can do better than this, as you just said, and so that was the impetus to sit down and do it. And for whatever reason, maybe I just wanted to impress Scott because we just become friends at the time, but I sort of volunteered to help, and he and I built the game. I say he and I mean, he deserves 99.9% of the credit because he is the brains behind making the rules as elegant and smooth as they are. But we spent hours and hours and hours at his dining table, working on the rules and playtesting them. And as I mentioned again before you started recording, the Falcon of the Duce book, one of the other scenario books that I've written, was our playtest sources for our playtest scenarios for the rules. And then we had all those scenarios already written, so we just slammed them together between 2 pieces of cardboard and put them on the shelf as a scenario book. But yeah, I have no background, don't understand anything about airplanes. It's all voodoo, right? How they stay up in the air. I don't know. They go fast enough, I guess, whatever it is.
BFM, black fucking magic. That's how they stay up in the air.
Right.
And usually, when the black magic goes out because the smoke comes out the back end and then the black magic's gone, they're going to fall out of the sky. So that's how we figured it out in aviation.
Yeah. So, but we wanted it to be, we wanted the rules to represent the pilots more than the airplanes. Obviously, the chrome is in the airplanes, and this airplane's really cool, and I want to fly that airplane. But we wanted to show that it was the pilot, that the most important thing is the pilot and not the plane that he's flying. And that was, one of the basics of the design philosophy of the game, was to ensure that it was about the man and not the machine. And so we went to great lengths to insert as much as possible the way into the rules, the way that a different skill leveled pilot will be able to manage flying his airplane in different ways. So, clearly a more skilled pilot is better able to manage his airplane than a less skilled pilot. So, pilot skill is one of the platforms of the game design, and it is, it's woven into the fabric of the game in every way we could think to do it that made sense.
That's one of the interesting things to look at, how different games give you more or less control of what the pilot's doing or assume more or less the pilot's skill. As we talk about air war, you basically had to fly that airplane. You had to know what your energy addition was, what your attitude was, what your altitude changes were, all those things. And you might as well have flown a flight simulator for playing that game, the level of detail it had. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum where you have games that are like Wings of Glory. You've got games like Blood Red Skies, where very much they are super generalized. The pilot, it's assuming the pilot knows what he's doing. You don't have to tell him how to make a hard turn. You don't have to tell him how to do an Immelman or a split S. You just say, hey, I want to go generally over here. Do I have to give up some energy, or as we call it, advantage in Blood Red Skies? And you assume the pilot knows the stick monkey skills to get themselves there. And then you don't have to track a lot of the information that you do in more complex games. But, as the disclaimer, as I said at the beginning, I still, horrible person that I am, have not played Check Your Six as much as I now own 4 different books for it. But it's one of those things that it at least impresses me that there are some decisions you get to make about how you get to a point in space and make some of those compromises. But it certainly is not super crazy granular detail about how much energy am I losing and what exactly is my climb angle and dive angle. My buddy Pat Doyle, who you guys have heard me talk about on the podcast, he was sending me some of the charts and diagrams from Birds of Prey, and I looked at that and I said, I have zero desire to play that game now that you've shown me that, because it is calculus on a chart, and no, I'm not good enough to do that. So that will turn me off a game pretty quick.
Yeah, so I like to think that check your six is in between those two extremes you talked about, and I'm going to tell you right now, it is the best air game ever written, and you better get
And
out
you're
and play
not
it.
biased at all.
I am not biased.
No, I was gonna say one of the great things about Check Your Six is the airplane sheet that comes with it, right? Is it kind of breaks it down in a very simple way that it's also easy to see what the differences between the airplanes are. So again, I've just kind of observed some of Rob's online games, but for as much freedom as it gives you as the pilot to make those actual decisions, it has a very intuitive way about doing it. So that's kind of what really intrigues me about getting into some Check Your Six games.
Yeah, right. And again, we tried to make it intuitive to as great an extent as possible, and we also, purposely built it so that it was visual, and those turn charts and maneuver sheets give you if you've never flown a plane before like me, you look at that sheet and you go, okay, I can see all of the things that this airplane that I'm flying today is capable of doing. But at the same time, you have to understand the level of understanding that's required for Check Your Six is, okay, if I pick that one, I can do it. But if I pick that one, there are repercussions to that, as we say in energy, which, is represented by different things in Check Your Six, usually by loss of speed. But so you can do some radical maneuver that a more skilled pilot may be able to do a more radical maneuver than a less skilled pilot, but he's got to pay the price in the effect it's going to have on what he can do in the next turn. So that's sort of how we tried to meet in the middle.
So that's a good segue to talking about how things change in rules and rule books, and obviously going from Check Your Six World War II prop age to suddenly going to the jet age rule book, and then needing to backfill that with stories and scenarios, because obviously you guys had play tested and really done a lot for the World War II side. Uh, by the time I come into this game years later, all these source books are already out there, thank goodness. So it's easy to pick them up and to sit there and go, oh, this is kind of cool. I get different flavor of different aircraft, and I get a little bit of tweaks on the rules. And it was kind of interesting to open up the Crisis in Kashmir source book, and from almost the very beginning, you say, "Hey, I realize you know how to play Check Your Six, but we're gonna have to do something different." And part of that is because this conflict is not World War II. This conflict is not Korea. It's not a U.S. client and a Soviet client fighting each other, or it's not a all-out huge air war. It's one independent air force and what the U.S. Air Force thought was a U.S. client, but really was kind of doing their own thing. And that mix of pilot skills and people who weren't necessarily all that experienced suddenly having to be engaged in 19 days of aerial combat and making bad decisions. And we'll talk about it a little bit in some of the special rules, but all of a sudden you had to be able to account for, in your campaign book, pilots turning the wrong way and leaving the fight accidentally and finding themselves alone, or, leaving the fight and fleeing in the wrong direction. And now do they have enough gas to get back to home base? So tell me a little bit with that as a construct, when you started digging into doing this Kashmir source book, what really drew you to it being the Kashmir conflict? Why did you say, let's pick this one that is so unlike anything else we've done?
Well, so unfortunately, that's just part of my nature. I'm drawn to
I'll take
the
the hard
stuff.
project. Thank you very much.
I remember back in the 90s, there was a guy who had a website called Weird Wars. And he did it was a wargamers site, but he concentrated on crazy stuff like, the soccer war of 19 62 or whatever it was. But it really, that really grabbed my attention and got me thinking about the really crazy stuff, and it just sort of fit with my personality. So I I picked the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 for several different reasons. One is that I'd never heard of it before, so I figured a lot of other people hadn't, and so it was going to be something that was not known, and therefore might be perk up a little more interest than some other subjects might. But
or
also,
you could get away with making historical mistakes and no one would call you out.
well, there is that too, especially considering there were only 2 resources in English that I could find at the time. But the other thing was, we obviously were had already spent a lot of time developing the jet age rules, which was a significant departure from the World War II prop age rules, not the least of which is that now the air battle takes place across the entire game board, not, usually in a World War II check your six game, it's a knot of airplanes somewhere in the middle and the table sort of turns around it. But now you can fly from one end of the table to the other in 2 or 3 turns. If you're flying an F-104, you can probably do it in 1 turn, but you're not gonna come back again. Yeah, exactly. Which is where some of those special rules come in. But so yeah, I wanted it to be. We all wanted it to be a sort of a transition book, so that you didn't jump straight from speed 3, speed 4 in a prop-driven plane to speed 7 in a Phantom, right? And radar homing missiles and IR missiles and things. Now there are IR missiles in the Kashmir book, but they are first generation IR missiles or maybe second generation IR missiles. So you're usually better off using your guns than your missiles. But we wanted it to be a transition, so it was a way to be able for people to move smoothly from the World War II Korea combat to a true jet age combat. Korea is sort of a hybrid, but so that was the second reason. But it was a fascinating thing to study, even despite the fact that there were only 2 resources to look at. And what you mentioned just a minute ago about the pilots, and they didn't have a lot of experience, and yet they were the elite of their country's military. But once they actually engaged in combat, it was your eyes open up. I mean.
Oh yeah, I thought it was just kind of funny to read the accounts because I'm reading through the India-Pakistan Air War of 1965 by Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra, and it's just funny when you read the accounts with people, like I said, turning the wrong way, getting lost, going and landing at Pakistani airfields when they thought they were landing at a Indian expeditionary airfield, and things that you would go, there's no way that's going to happen, and then you have to step back and realize, 20 years prior, this was a colonial air force for the Indians. And a lot of the Pakistanis at the time were members of that air force. And so you even have the air marshals on both sides of the 1965 air war are actually close friends. And they're close friends who grew up in similar aviation circumstances. So it's a very interesting study, at least to me as the amateur historian, in that not every war is a practiced, rehearsed, well thought out affair, that sometimes it's a pickup game and you're trying to find the right, at least on the aviation side, the right platform for the right mission on the right day. And those rules change all the time with what the enemy threat is for anti-aircraft, for their combat air patrols, and even what the weather is, or is it night? So for me, this conflict is fascinating, with airplanes that you thought would succeed or would be the game changers either getting shot down in the first couple of days or never getting into the conflict hardly at all because they were deemed too valuable. So, well, let's talk a little bit about the research, because you talked about your sources. Tell us a little bit about how you kind of had to overlay some of them to build the story, and then how you would cut through some of the propaganda and official record kind of language to find out what really happened.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, at the time that I was doing the research, as far as I could determine, there were only 2 sources in English. I'm sure if I could read Hindi or Urdu, I could have found others, but I don't, unfortunately. But I had what were essentially, they were not the official histories of the war from the governments, but they were essentially the official histories written by the air marshals or people who later became air marshal in the Indian Air Force and the Pakistani Air Force. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the titles, and the books are in storage right now. But
I have a similar problem.
yeah,
but yes,
yeah. But it was fascinating. It was truly fascinating to read these two books and read the accounts of the exact same engagement and see what the official story was and how different they were from the two sides. One side was positive that they'd shot down 8 of the enemy's aircraft and for no losses, and then the other side basically says the same thing. We shot down 8 of theirs for no losses, or they might actually come out and say, well, we did lose 1. But then
we'll give you that one, but the others know you didn't shoot them down.
Right, exactly. But I would have loved to have been able to find verified, losses and be able to bounce those off of the official accounts, so to speak. And somebody had done a little bit of research on that, although I think it was also biased because obviously both books were biased. But one side and the other would mention, well, we found the wreckage of the airplane, and the other side would say, well, that airplane came home, right? So that getting way down to the weeds, that part of it was kind of funny. But
well, yeah, and you even have that for Korea, because so much has come out in recent years where we've realized that both the U.S. Air Force, kill reporting there was inflated, as well as a lot of the Soviets who were flying for the North Koreans and for the Chinese at that point. Theirs wasn't necessarily the best documented either. They would shoot from ranges like 1,400 yards at a B-29, and if it puffed smoke, they'd say, "All right, we shot one down," because they'd see it start a diving turn. So all those kind of inaccuracies are just such a part of aviation history that it's tough when you have a conflict that is so propaganda driven as the India-Pakistan conflicts have been, just to dig through and find out really what happened and really be able to get to a kernel of truth to then try to build a scenario off of.
Yeah, and it was also interesting in the sense that to try to wade through that propaganda and to still give benefit of the doubt to, regardless of what they did or didn't accomplish, there's still courageous men who went up in the air and shot at each other. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. So, not always wanted to avoid anything that might look like we're poking fun at one side or the other or whatever. But at the same time, trying to represent the state of the training of those pilots at that time, as compared to NATO air forces, right? Whose countries had the money and the resources to put their pilots in the air all the time, and actually use live ammunition in training and things like that, right?
Well, it's a topic we'll discuss here one of these times in the podcast with Tom Cooper, and there's unfortunately a lot of emotion sometimes tied up in what are the skill levels of a nation's pilots, and that unfortunately sometimes flight hours do not equal the same as training hours. And just because pilots have a lot of flight time doesn't mean it's realistic training under all kinds of scenarios like NATO and Warsaw Pact both put their pilots through. And a lot of times people might have 300, 400 flight hours, but a lot of that was taking off, going to the pattern, going to the local bombing range, and coming back and landing, and not multi-element, low-level missions. And I know you talk about it in the beginning of your book, but a lot of the history books also mention that everyone thought these were going to be a high-altitude fight, and then almost the second day of the 1965 air war, they realized everyone's flying around low. And so all of a sudden, they're very disoriented in all their their habit patterns just aren't the same. They're not used to low altitude navigation. So on both sides, you get a lot of stories of pilots ending up attacking the wrong targets or approaching the target from the wrong direction because they flew past it, or getting lost on the way home.
Yeah, absolutely. And and even more extreme than that, pilots, a lot of pilots, at least more so on one side than the other, flying into the ground on a fairly regular
Yeah,
basis.
absolutely.
So you mentioned, or I mentioned, and then you picked up on the sort of the idea of one nation's pilots being better than another, and so one of the mechanics that we use in Check Your Six is a national advantage. So in a book like this, where it is the Pakistani Air Force against the Indian Air Force, in the tactical combat on the table, things go in phases depending on a lot of different criteria. So essentially what happens is the better a pilot is, the earlier or the later he gets to move, so that he gets to react to everybody else's moves, or the more altitude a pilot has, the later he makes his move, because he is able to see what's going on and use his energy to impact his decision making. But in the event that all of those different things end up being a tie and you have to figure out who gets to go first, it comes down to what we call national advantage. And so in the case of this book, national advantage goes to the Pakistanis. And the reason for that is because the perception that I got from my research was that the Pakistanis seemed to not only have the advantage of somewhat better training, but they also just, honestly, they seem to take it a little more seriously. And not saying that in any way to denigrate the fighting spirit and the professionalism of the Indian Air Force. It just came across that the Indian Air Force seemed to have adopted more of that gentleman's club approach that the RAF has, as opposed to the Pakistani Air Force, where it was, I don't know, a little bit more like, say, the Luftwaffe.
Well, and it's very interesting when you look at the historical accounts of, especially after the partition, and you see what has been previously the Royal Indian Air Force now be split up, and the Indian Air Force stays very much in their Royal Air Force traditions and ways of doing things. And the Pakistani Air Force, the United States courts them very quickly because they feel like they're going to be a key ally, obviously thinking the Pakistanis are going to be easier to manipulate and use and position against the Soviets than they really were. But they partner with, and they bring a lot of the Pakistani pilots over and fly them at the fighter weapons school with the Air Force, and fly them in the Sabres that they're getting them ahead of time. And so they are much more experienced in their platforms than the Indian Air Force. And you look at some of the pilots of the Indian Air Force, that the first time they saw a gnat or saw a hunter was kind of when their air marshals or whoever the test pilot was brought them back over. And some of them did conversion courses in the UK. Some of them didn't. Some of them did local courses. So they always had a kind of a very small cadre of people that knew what they were doing. And then there was the rest of the squadron that were either good or average based on how their leaders flew them. Very much a very small cell oriented way of training. So it made two very different air forces out there to try to simulate in the scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely different air forces. And, Chuck Yeager was, I believe he was the head of the training mission, at least for some point in time. But at any rate, I know he was in Pakistan and provided his own personal assessment of the Pakistani Air Force, back to DOD, to, have an impact on training dollars and things like that. But another advantage that the Pakistanis had is that they only had basically two types, right? They had
Right.
Sabres and they had F-104s.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it made a lot of things a lot easier for them. And another very interesting thing about the war is that both sides were very concerned about about losses to bombers, right? So they were in every tactical engagement, they were operating at the extreme of their range. So the engagements couldn't last very long because they were all going to run out of fuel. So that was a very interesting concept to bring into the scenario design as well. And so you see a lot of the special rules relate to, as you say, things like, well, you flew off the wrong edge of the board, buddy, you're not getting home.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just interesting looking at it through, my lens as a experienced aviator, that it's fascinating to think about having just not enough time on station to have one pass. Maybe you see the bandit, and if you can't turn and kill him in one turn, you're back out of there and you're leaving. And it's a very, very different mindset than I grew up with. But now it makes sense now, having read some of the history and realized that a lot of the pilots that they were going through, they were especially for like some of the ground attack missions, shooting their rockets at whatever airplane they could find on the runway and then getting back out of there to get home.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's more of those wonderful stories about how many aircraft and facilities we destroyed on the ground, with our 36 rockets that,
Right.
as you say, we fired at the limit of visibility.
Exactly. As they're getting shot at by all kinds of calibers of AAA, so they're not exactly probably making the most precise dive attack there. But I think one of the other things that you probably ran into as you're going through a lot of these official records, because I know you kind of allude to it in one of the scenarios we'll talk about here in a second, is there's time compression in a dogfight. When it's like a firefight, it's like anything else. When your adrenaline is up, you being able to debrief that very precisely after the fact probably isn't true, and things may seem like they took a lot longer, or things may have been instantaneous that weren't. And so it's interesting to read several accounts of things that they talk about, and specifically, Squadron Leader Alam's, dogfight over Sargodha, where it's 5 kills in 30 seconds is what the official record is. And then all of a sudden you have to reconcile that with the laws of physics and how the aircraft came to the target area. And you go, I don't know. I'm not going to say he's making it up, but that had to take a lot longer than 30 seconds. So, obviously you chose to break it into two scenarios and say, all right, we're going to put the stake in the ground that it was two different flights of hunters that he engaged, and it wasn't, all one group.
Yeah. And so I definitely had to take that one with a grain of salt. And it's a great story. And wouldn't it be really
it makes
cool
an awesome story, Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome if it was true. There's just the laws of physics just say it probably did not happen the way it was described.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that one, as well as pretty much every other engagement, honestly, I had to take the two quote official sources from both sides and sort of parse through it, and in many places or many instances I probably just said, okay, well, it certainly wasn't that, and it certainly wasn't that, it's somewhere here in the middle, and had to sort of massage it to be something that seemed more realistic. And maybe in some cases it really was as crazy as one extreme or the other was represented in one book or the other, but for the most part, when you're dealing with that, as you say, with that much propaganda involved in the history, and very little hard data, you just have to, when you're designing the scenario, you just have to try to be logical, and understand, get a feel for the abilities of the two sides as nations, and how they approached the war, and how they prepared for a war in the first place. And sort of translate that into a game balance, because obviously you don't want to create a scenario that's not balanced unless it happens to be part of a campaign that's balanced, which is something I do sometimes. But yeah, to design the scenarios is really it's really about compromise, and just trying to be logical about the capabilities that both sides bring to the fight.
Well, one of the resources that we have now that I guess is an unfair advantage is there's been a number of articles written by Indian Air Force pilots that weren't there in the 1965 fight, but they were analyzing those actions, and they've been written probably in the last 3 or 4 years. And because we're all visual people with computers and smartphones and Google Earth, they've done some really good physical reconstructions. And there's now, you can go out, and I wish I could remember the author's name. I apologize, terrible interviewer that I am. But there's a whole series of breakouts of a lot of these engagements by a guy who's a former MiG-27 pilot. And so he goes through with a pilot's level of detail and says, well, if we know the airplane crashed here and we know the bandits approached from this heading, the engagement had to have happened here. And this guy says he made 2 left turns, but we think he only made it through 1 left turn before he got shot down. And so there's a lot of interesting resources out there now for people who are amateur historians or find themselves like me trying to write scenarios, and try to make things at least feel right. Because I don't know about you, but there's a lot of times that I would read the accounts, and you read both sides accounts and you go, I just can't decide. There's a kernel of truth somewhere there in between both of them, and both of them make great stories, but I don't know. And so how did you pick that? How did you really sit there and say, okay, I'm going to make this scenario reflect more of the Indian account or more of the Pakistani account?
So that's an excellent question. And there's some of the part of the answer is artistic license, right? And gameplay balance. But you want to capture the stuff that really, piques your interest and sparks your imagination when you're reading it. You don't want to just throw that out because it seems outlandish. So you just have to find a way to, well, there are 2 ways to approach it. One is to find a way that compromise in a scenario, or you break it up, as I did with Alam, you break it up into more than 1 scenario and you balance it across the number of scenarios. And in every one of the Check Your Six scenario books, they are broken down into mini campaigns, and then the book itself is an overall campaign. So we don't necessarily always 100% play balance an individual scenario, because you can extend the play balance across the mini campaign. Yeah.
Well, and I'm a fan of asymmetric scenarios, and Steve and a lot of the other Blood Red Skies players laugh at me because I will gladly write and or play a totally unbalanced scenario if it gives me the feel of what the historical account was like. And I chose to take a different tack. So by the time this podcast episode drops, there should be a lead pursuit squad or scenario pack for India, Pakistan, 1965, with just a handful of scenarios, not a whole lot of new special rules past what we did for Taiwan Straits. But one of the things I did was I instead of splitting into 2 scenarios, I almost I made the Squadron Leader Alam scenario kind of a they will come in waves scenario, where as soon as 5 hunters leave the board, 5 more hunters show up. And so you find yourself in a case where you either appreciate how difficult it would be to do what he said he did in 30 seconds, or you find yourself going, wow, I was in the right place at the right time. And as those hunters left the board, more hunters ended up right in front of me, and I was able to shoot some down.
Doug, I gotta agree with you though. Like, the unbalanced scenarios sometimes are super fun as just a gamer, right? I always, even when you talk in like Blood Red Skies context, when you talk about a scenario like Bounced, where it's basically set up for you to lose that scenario starting in like the most disadvantaged way possible. The times that even you lose, but you put up a good fight, you're like, even when you lose, you kind of leave that game like, oh man, I almost had you, or oh man, if I would have just done this, it would have been a different outcome, So those as a gamer are super fun.
Well, and I think, at least in Blood Red Skies, because it's such a low overhead to set up and play, that, and I've said it a number of times, even if you lose Bounced on the second turn, you've only wasted 15, 20 minutes of your life. So set up the game and play it again. Because there's a lot, one, as a war gamer, to learn from disadvantaged setups, but 2, with a super generalized game and not a lot of tracking and not a lot of papers and charts and scenario prep, it's pretty easy to totally punt a scenario and come back and go, all right, we're going to try that again, and I'm going to turn left instead of turning right. See if the tactics work out any different for you.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and I love I love for a scenario to be challenging. Obviously, it's better if it's challenging for both sides, but I love it to be challenging, really difficult for one side, but but they definitely have the chance to win. And if they win, it's spectacular. And that's
Absolutely.
always that's always, if you're that guy or that team that wins, then that's one of your greatest gaming experiences, especially if it's a con and you can jump up on the chair and scream and yell and say, I won.
Exactly. Well, as you're working your way building these scenarios, obviously you have to get to that calculating of the victory points and kind of building out how the scenario is going to give both players a a chance at having fun and also saying they accomplished something. I thought it was interesting that for Crisis in Kashmir, you really built a couple different things in. You had basic victory points based on how much, how many aircraft to the other side you'd shot down, and I found your weighting of that interesting, and I won't pick on you for that, but it's everyone's historical take onto which of the two factions could absorb those losses, both publicly and in their air forces. But then you have board exit victory points, which I thought was awesome, and I don't know why I'd never really thought about it specific to analyzing not just if they leave the board, they either count as a kill or don't count as a kill, but which part of the board did they leave from?
Yeah, because sometimes you win by leaving. I mean, in real
Yeah.
life, right? Learn to live to fight another day. Preserve the force, that becomes important in the strategic concept. So, yeah, you obviously have to have your basic victory points for airplanes are worth, you shoot one down, it's worth this. You kill or capture an ace pilot, that's worth something extra. But for Crisis in Kashmir, partially because the history is just so interesting, the political situation and and how it all related to Pakistan being our ostensible ally and yet doing exactly opposite of everything we wanted them to do, which they had the right to do, but except that we gave them the things with the understanding that they wouldn't use them for those purposes. But hey, they're a sovereign nation.
Security assistance. It never works the way you imagine.
Right. But I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to do something special to try to capture that part of it, so that if you want to play the game as just one scenario and just play tactical airplanes and have a dogfight, you can do that. But if you want to try to replicate or enjoy how the air war had an impact on the greater 1965 Indo-Pakistani war, and how it related to the great the superpowers and the rest of the world, you could play the Kashmir campaign. And so I created a parallel structure, so you could get regular victory points, just like for any scenario. And then if you wanted to play the campaign, there were also these things called Kashmir points, which are essentially campaign victory points. And if I recall correctly, it's been a long time since I read the book, you can actually use your victory points, like money, to influence the number of Kashmir points that you receive. So that in that way, I was trying to replicate the impact that a tactical situation or a tactical outcome can have on the operational and strategic aspect of the war itself. So you as the player can say, I might lose 10 victory points if I sacrifice these planes, but there's something going on here behind the scenes that allows that is in the long run better for me, right? Making a sacrifice for the long-term gain. A lot of people, some people seem to enjoy the Kashmir campaign, and I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say a lot of people enjoy it. And some people, like Scott Fisher, call it the tax form.
Yeah.
But
I did laugh when I realized that the middle part of the rule book is literally, I think, 5-6 pages devoted to how to record keep for your Kashmir campaign.
Yeah, but I had a lot of fun with that.
Well, and I could tell a lot of thought went into it, and I didn't pick up on it when I first read through the source book. I'll be honest, I read through, went to the scenarios, and ooh, those are really cool. Ooh, that's some cool force mixes. Let's go back and look at the campaign. Hey, there's victory points, Kashmir points is cool. There's some different events, and there's a battle tracker. And it wasn't until getting ready for this episode I went back and I said, hey, I'm gonna math hammer this out. I'm gonna go through the example that's in there, and I'm gonna look at the battlefield tracker. And then I suddenly realized how even asymmetrical the campaign game was. And actually, that was a moment of, ooh, I really want to play this, because I realized that the starting the level of effort for both sides starting, just regardless of what scenario was played, it would take different victory point allotments and cashmere point allotments to be able to influence the die rolls to be able to successfully move the tracker. And it wasn't just, okay, you won a scenario, it will move one left, or you won a scenario, it'll move one right. It was, that's awesome, India. Good luck moving the tracker to the left, because it's a 10 that you have to roll, and then have enough victory points to modify it. So
Yeah, and I like the game to be simple, but I don't like what's behind it to be simple. I like a lot of depth and complexity in that part of it, and that's why obviously the campaign is completely optional. You can play the game and it's very simple, but if you want to play the campaign, you got to put your head into it, and think it through and realize what the choices are that you have to make. Where you make that short-term sacrifice for the long-term gain. And as you go through, because I know you're going to play the Kashmir campaign, so I'm just going to tell you this. The weighting shifts through the war,
right.
And you have to understand that as well. Now it's sort of being prescient, I suppose, to understand that it's going to be tougher for you later, or it's going to be easier for you later, depending which side you're playing. But you still need to figure out just how much easier, how much easier is it going to be for me? How much can I sandbag in the beginning? Or do I really need to, to put all my eggs in one basket this time and really go for that major Kashmir point so that I can, move the battle tracker? So, yeah.
Well, and there's still a level of pure luck to some of it. And the example that's in the scenario is kind of funny because it kind of walks you through that of, two bad dice rolls back to back can leave you expending a lot of Kashmir points and a lot of victory points and still not getting any further. And, you couple that with the other side, maybe deciding to spend some points and do a campaign event. And all of a sudden, either maybe you're penalized even more victory points, or maybe they have a plus up in their Kashmir points or victory points that makes everything even more unbalanced. And you're like, holy crap, how did I end up in a hole this far? But yeah, it really makes me want to play it. I don't know that I'm going to find time in my schedule for 19 games of Check Your Six, but I'm sure that's something that Sandy and Rob would love to walk me through.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound like I'm tooting the Check Your Six horn, but really, you can play 2 or 3 games of Check Your Six in an evening.
That's what they tell me. I'm always cynical about it because I'm like, oh, I got to learn the system, and then I'm going to stop and have people explain it to me. And yeah, so I'm absolutely sure that you can when you're comfortable. I just am not comfortable because I read the rule book and I go, oh, it's another set of rules. I got to push little airplanes around hexes and figure this out again. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, clearly, it's obviously the more you play it, the easier it gets. But when we playtest scenarios for these books, we'll playtest them. We might playtest one scenario 4 or 5 times in one evening.
Right.
And right. I mean, granted, we're so familiar with the rules that we can get to a point where in the game where we say, okay, we can call it now, sooner than some other people might be able to call it, and say that's just there's a problem with the play balance. It's just not working out, or we know it's not going to work out in the end because of what we see right now, and then we can stop and play it again. But that's really not the point I was making. The point I was making is that we tried to make the rules simple. And even though it's a jet age game, you're not in Kashmir. You're not dealing with the crazy stuff like we've written. We're getting ready to publish one on the Iran-Iraq War, which I've
excellent
for years, and it's an awesome book. I can't wait for it to come out. We've put so much cool stuff into it, but yes, then the complexity rises, and you will definitely want to have played, India, Pakistan, 1965 before you try to play Iran-Iraq, 1984.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so looking at as I call it, 19 scenarios for 19 days, I thought it was interesting because as a historian, you sit there and you read through the accounts, and there's some rather bland accounts in the history. And at least what you have done is you've given it that feel of 19 different actions in there that kind of hit all the major occurrences. And if you're really not paying attention, you don't look at the dates, and you don't realize there are some days that neither side found the other for whatever reason, whether it's for weather, for political reasons, because they're really expensive airplanes had just been shot down the day prior. But as you were doing the research for all the scenarios, what really came out and was kind of a surprise to you, just knowing about aerial combat as you're looking at what you're going to pick and choose and put in there? Were there things that you couldn't fit into this book events that you wanted to put in there, or likewise, were there events that you found, all right, I've got to kind of make this a little bit more interesting so it actually makes a scenario rather than kind of what historically may have sounded like a one-sided encounter?
Yeah, very good questions. So one of the most difficult things about writing a book of air combat scenarios is avoiding making every scenario just like every other scenario. The only difference is how many planes are on the board, maybe. And
oh, I know that problem already, unfortunately.
Yeah. So that's where you have to get a feel for the history and get creative with the special rules, get creative with the victory conditions, and try to give a feel for what it was the pilots and their command were concerned about at the time. It's not just about going up and shooting down another airplane, right? You got a mission to accomplish. What was that mission they were trying to accomplish, and what might they have felt were acceptable losses in the pursuit of that accomplishing that mission? So that's that part of the answer. But were there things that I would have liked to have put in the book that I couldn't fit? I wouldn't say I couldn't fit them. What the problem was, I couldn't make them playable. So I would have loved to have done more with bombers, with actual bombers, because I can't even think of what airplane it is right now. Basically. Oh, shoot. Well, anyway, the bomber that they had on both sides.
Canberras, yes, the B-57.
Yeah, Canberras, yes, B-57 Canberra, yeah. I have such a cool little model of one, and I never, got to do anything with it. But there just wasn't any way to make those scenarios playable, because it was either they flew in and they were unimposed, or they just flew in and got completely massacred, and there was no way that wasn't going to happen in the scenario, right?
Yeah,
So
or the infamous, the only reason they got shot at is because they descended in a turn, and you're like, how do I model this? This is
Right.
going to be a little interesting, So yeah, I
Yeah.
can totally understand that. I did laugh at a number of the special and variable rules that are in there, because it's not, your sense of humor obviously comes out in there, because there's standard things you want to do in any scenario, and you're like, all right, if we want to make it variable, let's take some of the pilots and make them not as good, or other ones better. And it's just funny to read some of the variable rule names, for obviously the a couple of the guys that turned the wrong way, and then some of the guys that got lucky shots, the lucky Lieutenant Yusuf, or the really lucky Lieutenant Yusuf, guys that lose pilot skill, really bad eggs for breakfast. Another one breaks the wrong way. So when one of the green air crew gets removed for turning the wrong direction, there was at least a sense of humor in there that I really appreciated, dealing with the scenarios, because I think one of the things longtime war gamers who aren't grognards and don't take themselves too seriously always enjoy is when there's something challenging that's also slightly funny, because we've all had it, whether we've had terrible dice rolls, or there's no way that I'm going to not be in charge range of this unit, and then it turns out you're half an inch out of charge range or something like that. All those things that make for funny events. I thought it was really good to have the same kind of humor put into the scenario, so at least keeps people from taking themselves too seriously, hopefully, as they're playing through the campaign.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of trying to help people not take themselves too seriously, because it is, after all, a game, and we're supposed to be having fun. And I'm also a big fan of humor. So I like to come up with the pithy rule name, or whatever it might be. But at the risk of, again, sounding like I'm denigrating one side or the other, there was a lot of funny shit.
Oh yeah, there was. And I read the accounts as an aviator, and And my problem is I read them as an instructor and as a, experienced, weapons systems officer. And I sit there and I go, oh my God, if I had to debrief that flight coming back, I think it would start with, what were you people doing? Was anybody watching me? Was anyone listening when I said, go left, break left, and everyone went right, but I also at the same time have a little bit of, I guess, mental mercy for the pilots, because I've been out there where literally you come back and said, Lead, you said break left. And Lead's like, play the tape again. I said break right. And you're like, okay, both of us in this cockpit heard left and we're a bunch of morons. So, things like that happen out there. It's confusing. Radios get garbled, or even as in some of the events, people aren't on the right frequency and they can't tell the bombers down there that they're being joined on by sabers. So, it's really interesting to hear those parts of the account.
Yeah, and that was one of the more interesting things about doing the research for this book. Having done a lot of research on World War II scenarios and Korea and some of Vietnam, even though the two accounts were highly propagandized, it was still clear that they did a lot of stupid shit, and they just laid it right out there for you to know. And so that's why, I developed for this book the -1 pilot. And usually pilots are rated from 0 to +3. And I said, I'm sorry, but we have to have a -1 pilot in this, because I have never done any research where so many people were doing so much stupid shit as I discovered in these books.
Well, and I think that's a good part of having aviators writing the history, at least it has seemed on both sides. While there's still a lot of, quote, official account, there are people who grew up in a culture of debriefing. And so they're used to, within the limits they're given by their government, airing the dirty laundry so other people don't make those mistakes. And I know we talked about it when we were talking through Eric Hartman's story, and the fact that, Eric Hartman even himself tells the lessons of all the times he crashed airplanes, the times he ran himself out of gas, the times he shot himself down by being too close to the Russian fighter that he joined on. So, it's one of those things that reading through stories, I sit there and go, oh, I can totally identify with how everything went from well organized to an absolute shit show in about 30 seconds, because I'm pretty sure I've been in those same flights.
Yeah, and hopefully we capture that with the special rules in every scenario. The option. Well, I forget the term we use now for some reason, but all those pithy rule titles down at the bottom of the scenario sheet, and I'll say this: every one of those rules is developed in regard to some particular historical incident or event that occurred while we were doing the research. Now, they may get repeated. It might be such a cool little rule, we repeat it in more than one scenario just because it's so much fun. But we don't make those up off the top of our head. They are related to some actual historical event that occurred.
Well, things like maintenance by the Vespa headlight, you sit there and you go, I remember some of the stories of them talking about the things, how they did stuff at their expeditionary airfields. And I even laugh about the story of them deploying the MiG-21s forward that were not designed to be deployed. And, their ground crews showing up barely a couple hours ahead of them and, having no idea what they're going to do. And then finally the Indian government making the decision, we're going to pull those MiGs out of there because you boys don't know what you're doing right now. And those MiGs are too valuable to us. We need those back defending the capital and everything else rather than, forward deployed in the front lines.
Yeah. And, that is the flip side of the Pakistani Air Force only having two types, basically, or three types if you count the B-57s, and the Indians having this plethora of crazy aircraft, including stuff that nobody else in the world would consider flying at that point in history, but it was all they had. But I tried also to bring that into the historical context of As you say, we're not gonna risk those airplanes. That's national prestige. We can't have the Pakistani Air Force shoot down every one of our MiG-21s. Nobody will ever take us seriously again. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Which, people may look at the victory point balances for some of these things, but you have to understand that there were certain airplanes that were seen as strategic assets. The F-104 and the MiG-21 were both that way. They were low density, high visibility, lots of national pride put into them. And as a result, if you lose one of those, you're going to get penalized heavily in the scenarios.
yeah, exactly. And again, that is, as you say, you look at the victory points and you go that plane is not worth that much more compared to that other plane. But the point is, as you just said, it's a question of the bigger picture, and so it may not make sense in the individual scenario, but it does make sense in the campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we've been talking for almost an hour, and in an attempt to wrap this up slightly, because I could talk about this conflict for quite a while, uh, other than your playtest group, have you heard back from other Check Your Six players that have played the Crisis in Kashmir? What have people said about the scenarios, the campaign rules, and kind of the overall feel of this source book, campaign book as different than the others?
Yeah, it's gotten very good reviews, so to speak. We have a Check Your Six Yahoo group, and everybody seems to enjoy the Crisis in Kashmir scenarios. Everybody loves the fact that there are -1 pilots in it, and that if you make a mistake in your F-104, you're just going to fly off the edge of the board, never to be seen again.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Thank you for playing. You're gone.
Yeah. But I think most people, I'm pretty sure, are intimidated by the record keeping required for the Kashmir campaign. And I don't obviously I don't push anybody to do anything with it, but it is a lot of fun if you do it. If you take the time, and it seems a little complicated at first, but if you take the time, it becomes this really, really cool mechanic, and you can be literally losing on the battlefield, but winning strategically in the war. And part of it, as you say, is there is still an element of luck, because there is always an element of luck in everything we do. And if your luck is really bad, it might cause you to lose the war, but your luck can turn, and
Exactly.
you can win in the end. So I would encourage anybody who happens to listen, who's thinking about playing Crisis in Kashmir, to give the campaign a try.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, I know we've kept you on mute for much of the night. Any last questions or anything to offer?
No, just that I have to make a point to get on the board with Rob and get some Check Your Six in.
Yeah, we do.
I got to do it, right, because it's so interesting to me, and I just like how we were talking about earlier, that it's more like you're really controlling the intricacies of the airplane. And just add one more crisis or little war or global action that I have to get another book and read up on now, as seems to be the never-ending rabbit hole of wargaming. So
yeah, exactly. I've been happy to put my World War II history books to the side and now stock up on all my India-Pakistan conflict ones. So, yeah, I'll be doing a little bit of reading now. So it's one of those things. It's good. That's why I play war games. It's not just for the fun of competing with someone across the table, but for a lot of the historical learning. Because even as a Marine Corps aviator, this is not a conflict I ever studied. It was not in any of our doctrine. It was not in any of our books. There were no quotes from any of the aviators involved. Yet there's some really cool lessons, especially as a weapons and tactics instructor or a squadron level instructor, on how to make people more effective in combat and keep people from turning the wrong way and flying to the wrong airfield, and bring the airplanes back the way they should. Well, CB, thanks for joining us, and thanks for humoring two non-Check Your Six players with our questions, and talking to us about the Crisis in Kashmir book for Check Your Six for the Jet Age, part of that. Once again, we'll offer you the invitation anytime you want to show up and play Blood Red Skies. We'll show you how to play a super generalized game, and we'd always love to have you back on the podcast to talk, especially about Iran-Iraq war source books when those come out. So put us on your schedule to chat all about that.
Absolutely, I'd love to do it, and I will be happy to take up your invitation to come down and play Blood Red Skies. But I know that once you drink the Kool-Aid and you learn Check Your Six, you are never going to play that game
I'm
again.
never, exactly. We'll see how. Challenge accepted. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, and to all of our listeners, I'd like to remind you to go out and like the podcast, give us some feedback. Leave us messages there on Facebook, Instagram, via the website. Tell us, stop talking about Check Your Six. We're not playing that game. We're diehard Blood Red Skies fans, and then we'll tell you where you can stick that idea, because this is an aerial wargaming podcast, not just a Blood Red Skies podcast. Although that's going to be our focus, I think, for the next 30 to 60 days, getting ready for Gathering of Eagles, and I'll make that last shameless plug before we jump off the air here. If you have nothing to do on June 4th through the 6th, would love to come down to lovely New Orleans and drink a lot of beer and maybe play war games in amongst all that beer. We'll be down there. The registration is on the Lead Pursuit site, leadpursuit.net/GOE. And you can get on there, get your good hotel rate, and come down and play Blood Red Skies with us, or just talk about aviation and drink beer with us. We really don't care. No pressure. Like we said in the previous episodes, just because we talk about tournaments and playing Blood Red Skies a lot, we've had more than a handful of people just show up and talk airplanes. So we look forward to seeing everyone there. CB, thanks again. Steve, thanks for being on the podcast with me. We will see everybody next week.